giving me the balance of the time between now and 10:40 to use at my discretion. Thank you very much for those 20 minutes. I'll try to fill these minutes appropriately. I appreciate that time, sir. We'll ignore your 4-minute time that just started. Dr. Lindsay, I oftentimes spend at least I speak at a school in South Carolina every month. I think the future is in those schools. I want to spend time understanding and appreciating what's in their minds and how they view the issue of fairness. And it very often comes up. And one of the questions I typically ask is, if an American or a bunch of Americans earn 22% of AGI, but they pay 38% of the taxes, is that fair? And I haven't found a child so far who thinks that's fair. I ask the question, if you make 50% of the income, or 50% of the folks make 11% of the income and only pay 3% of the taxes, is that fair? I haven't found a kid yet who believes that's fair. Now, certainly we appreciate the progressive nature of the tax code, but most kids, and I speak in many inner city schools, can't understand and appreciate that the definition that we use for fair doesn't match anything that they would use for fair. And so from my perspective, help me understand why those kids are wrong, that they believe that disproportionately, if you make X and you pay twice as much, that's unfair. That makes sense to me.
That's because they haven't done the Harvard yet.
Let me make that note real quick here, sir, because I think you have a point.
I think the common sense definition of fairness is exactly what you're saying. I am, maybe because I've been around too long, I'm actually somewhat persuaded by the notion that of progressivity. But I think there has to be some limit on that. And as I've noticed in chart 2 of my paper, the ratio of the average taxes paid at the top to those that paid at the bottom has increased dramatically over the last few years. So I think we're now pushing the limits on that. And secondly, in spite of that fact, we have the rise in income inequality. So at best, it's ineffective, and at worst, I think it's pernicious.
We were talking earlier about the impact that our tax code and the regulatory burden may have or may not have on creating or stopping entrepreneurs from being created. Having been an entrepreneur for the last 20 years, I will tell you that one regulatory burden is not knowing your regulatory burden. And frankly, as an entrepreneur, when you add them all together, whether it's the state, whether it's the local, whether it's unfunded mandates that come down from the federal government, the fact of the matter is that the challenge that we face as entrepreneurs is that we don't have an HR department. We don't have a gang of lawyers waiting to do work for free. We take that role upon ourselves. Then when you put on top of that the inability to find access to capital because of the increasing capital gains tax, you start stifling the innovative nature of entrepreneurs who typically hire people from their own communities, which then has a disproportionate effect on smaller businesses, on minority communities, and those companies that are not yet legacy companies. Would you like to comment on that, Dr. Murdoch?
Thank you. It's just Mr. Murdoch, unfortunately. But
Mr. Murdoch, yes.
I appreciate the promotion while I'm here. I think you're absolutely right, Senator. I think that you have companies facing local regulations, state regulations, federal regulations, in many instances not knowing what the regulations are. With Obamacare, for example, you're starting a company trying to figure out what your labor costs are. And there are a lot of questions as to what will the subsidies be or not be, how much are you going to make, what will your premium be, et cetera. And there are just a lot of question marks. And I've never seen a spreadsheet where there's a question mark on the bottom line that'll help you make any sort of a decision. So I think regulatory relief needs to be part of the equation to advance freedom and prosperity across the board, and as you say, especially in minority communities across the country.
I know my time is up now. Do I have time for another question?
It is 10:22. We did have a hard stop because of the Prime Minister address to the Congress. If you can make it quick.
Certainly.
No problem with it. Okay.
Mr. Murdoch, one thing I noted in your comments had to do with school choice. In my opinion, when we think about the issue of tax fairness and moving forward, if we don't educate those kids who are going to help us solve the problem of entitlement spending, we find ourselves in a very unfair position moving forward, and certainly they do as well. And when I look at the impact in the tax code of not providing preferences to those parents who are already paying for public education but unable to find a high-performing school in their neighborhoods. It seems to me consistently unfair that that person, a single mom like mine, will pay the tax but will not be able to afford to send their student, their child, to a school of their own choosing. That, to me, seems to be fundamentally unfair, number one. Number two, seems to lead to great disparity in who can pay taxes and who will pay taxes long term. Thoughts?
I think you're
Either
right.
one.
I think you're correct about that. I think one of the things that fuels the inequality on which we focused today is the fact that a lot of people who are stuck in either with poor jobs or no jobs, they're not getting the kind of educations they need in order to get the knowledge and skills and even the contacts that they need in order to prosper in society. And one of the ways out and one of the ways to improve this is school choice, to improve inner city schools so that children actually can get a chance to learn something, to get the skills, be able to graduate out of high school. We have a high school graduation rate in a lot of urban centers of dropout rate, I should say, of 50%. Half the kids are not graduating high school. They never catch up, and they stay behind for life, not just for 4 or 5 years, for life. That is a national crisis, and I think, unfortunately, the government school system in the United States I describe as a system of largely of institutionalized child abuse.
Senator Scott, I need to move on. I want to thank